Well, this morning we are going to look at a story of salvation. We're going to look in the book of Acts because we've been going through the book of Acts as a junior church for a little while, and we're going to get to Acts chapter 9 today. But before we do that, before I read this, for the kids, if you're under 12, I've got some pictures on the screen here, and I want you to help me out. Can you tell me who this character is, the main guy in the middle? Samuel. He's Gru. Okay. And the next one? Who's this guy? Somebody other than Samuel. Oh, Malachi. Wreck-It Ralph. That's Ralph from Wreck-It Ralph. Okay, who? And we've got one more. Okay, this guy. Who is he? The Grinch. Okay, what do these three characters have in common, do you think? Shout it out. They're all the bad guys from the movie, right? They all start out pretty miserable. They're the villains. They want to be the baddest bad guys there are. But something happens, doesn't it? Because at the end of each of these, they have changed. Right. Our story in Acts chapter 9 tells us something about somebody that would have been the biggest bad guy around for the early church. But something changes, and it's a lot more dramatic than Gru or the Grinch, and it's real. So we're going to read from Acts chapter 9, verse 1 to 19. And as I'm reading, I want you to listen. I want you to listen to what happens to this man called Saul. Where is he headed? What is his direction at the start of this episode? And then, where does he get turned around? Where is he headed in the middle? And then what's his direction at the end? So let's read from Acts chapter 9, verse 1 to 19. But Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues at Damascus, so that if he found any belonging to the way, men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. Now, as he went on his way, he approached Damascus, and suddenly a light from heaven shone around him, and falling to the ground, he heard a voice saying to him, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" And he said, "Who are you, Lord?" And he said, "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. But rise and enter the city, and you will be told what you are to do." The men who were traveling with him stood speechless, hearing the voice but seeing no one. Saul rose from the ground, and although his eyes were opened, he saw nothing. So they led him by the hand and brought him into Damascus. And for 3 days he was without sight, and neither ate nor drank. Now there was a disciple at Damascus named Ananias. The Lord said to him in a vision, "Ananias." And he said, "Here I am, Lord." And the Lord said to him, "Rise and go to the street called Straight, and at the house of Judas look for a man of Tarsus named Saul, for behold, he is praying. And he has seen in a vision a man named Ananias come in and lay his hands on him so that he might regain his sight." But Ananias answered, "Lord, I have heard from many about this man, how much evil he has done to your saints at Jerusalem. And here he has authority from the chief priests to bind all who call on your name." But the Lord said to him, "Go, for he is a chosen instrument of mine, to carry my name before the Gentiles and kings and the children of Israel. For I will show him how much he must suffer for the sake of my name." So Ananias departed and entered the house, and laying his hands on him, he said, "Brother Saul, the Lord Jesus, who appeared to you on the road by which you came, has sent me so that you may regain your sight and be filled with the Holy Spirit." And immediately something like scales fell from his eyes, and he regained his sight. Then he rose and was baptized, and taking food, he was strengthened. This is an incredible story. It's a story that is repeated quite a few times in the Bible because of its importance to us. But I wonder if you're listening, where was Saul headed? What was his direction at the start of this story? Does any of the kids remember? Where was Saul going? Shout it out. Oh, he was coming from Jerusalem. He was going to... somebody older than 12 then. Where was he going? He was on his way to Damascus. And his intention in Damascus was not to go and make friends. See, Saul had got letters from the chief priests so that he could go to the synagogues, the places where the Jews worshipped in Damascus, with notices on them saying, Christians wanted, dead or alive. Saul was on a mission to go and get anybody who followed Jesus and to arrest them or worse. And he would haul them back to Damascus. Now, what's the longest you've ever walked for? You know, some people walk the kilt walk, don't they? They walk all the way from Aberdeen all the way to Braemar. That is a long walk. And they do it because they think it's a really good cause. Well, the journey from Jerusalem to Damascus was 6 days. And Saul set out on this journey because he thought it was a good cause. He thought he was doing something good. He thought he was going to do God's work and keep the Jewish church pure by getting rid of these troublesome Christians who were following a dead guy called Jesus and saying that he was the Messiah, that he was the king that God had sent. And so Saul went on this journey and he was breathing out murderous threats. That's what it says. Like some sort of a fire-breathing dragon, Saul goes to capture Christians and to haul them back. Saul had got things very wrong. He was on a journey to Damascus to destroy, but he had got things very wrong. He thought he was on God's side, but he was actually fighting against God. And the reason he got things so wrong was because he got Jesus so wrong. He thought that Jesus was trouble, and anybody who followed Jesus was trouble. And because he got Jesus wrong, he was on the wrong side of God. And this is a huge point for us. You know, we might think that we're nice people doing good things. We might even think that we're quite religious and upright, and God would be quite pleased with us. But what we think about Jesus and what we do with Jesus is absolutely essential. Because if we have the wrong view of Jesus, then we are on the wrong side of God. And that's what Saul comes to discover in the middle part of his journey. He's on his way to Damascus, and then his direction gets changed. So he was headed to Damascus, and then there was this bright light, and there was a loud voice. There was a light that was so bright that it was brighter than the noonday sun. So the other places that Saul told this story, and for those of you who might know, Saul is also called Paul. And forgive me if I call him Paul and Saul, but he had this same name, Paul and Saul. These two names were his. And Paul, Saul, later tells his story, and he tells us that he was going to Damascus, and it was in the middle of the day, in the brightness of the sun. Now, last night, some of you might have been outside and seen some bright lights, those fireworks going off over the park, and even the brightness of the fire, which was impressive. Now, they looked seriously bright because it was dark. You know, you set those fireworks off in the middle of the day, they're really not all that impressive, are they? But the light that shone in Damascus on the way, when Saul was on his way there, was brighter than the noonday sun, so that it blinded him. It dazzled him, and it dazzled him so much that he fell to the ground. No longer was he headed to Damascus, he was headed down. And he went down onto the ground, and he must have been terrified. And he heard this voice speaking to him. And did you notice what the voice said? It said, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" And Saul must have been a little confused. And in fact, he says so much. He says, "Who are you?" He says, "Who are you, Lord?" But we could also say, "Who are you, sir?" That's the kind of word he uses. Who are you? I've not met you before. I'm surely not persecuting you. I haven't even met you. And then the voice comes back and says, "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting." And here we learn something incredible about Jesus and his church. See, Saul had thought he was attacking a small bunch of relatively insignificant, weak, obscure Christians. They weren't a big, strong group by any means, and Saul was attacking them. But then suddenly he's met with somebody that is powerful and glorious and terrifying, and this bright light and this loud voice booms and says, "You're persecuting me." And Saul must have been quaking at this stage. You see, when Christ's church is attacked, he is attacked. And it's maybe something like, I don't know if you could imagine the school bully picks on this little P1 child and relentlessly picks on them and steals their lunch and kicks them in the shins and picks on them and picks on them. And then one day the school bully is confronted by the biggest P7, the one that everybody is afraid of. And they say, "What are you doing?" And the bully says, "Well, what do you mean, what am I doing? I don't even know you. I have not gone near you." And says, "Well, that P1, that's my sister. And when you pick a fight with her, you pick a fight with me." Now, that's something in a very small scale like what Jesus does here. He says, "You pick on my church, you pick on me." And Saul realized he had got Jesus all wrong. Jesus was alive and he was powerful, and the church belonged to him, not to Saul. And here we have something of a surprise in this story, because what happens next? When the bully Saul is confronted by the powerful Jesus, we expect Saul to get his comeuppance. We expect him to get what he has been giving to the church. Now, he'd been trying to destroy the church, and now it's his turn. But no, Jesus says, "Get up, rise, and go into Damascus." But we see that Saul can't do this on his own. He's blind. He can't see a thing. He's in absolute darkness. And he's in that state for 3 days. And he doesn't eat or drink anything. It's almost as though Saul is in a state of death for these 3 days. Darkness, no food, no water. And he's waiting for what's going to happen next, because Jesus has told him to go there and wait for instructions. And we find then somebody else is introduced into this story that changes the direction of Saul. The man who I would be impressed if anybody could remember his name. Oh, does anybody remember his name? Ananias. Ananias was the man. And Ananias was a follower of Jesus. He lived in Damascus. And Ananias would have been on Saul's hit list. You know, if Saul had caught Ananias, he would have handcuffed him and dragged him back to Jerusalem in a heartbeat. But God comes to Ananias and he says, "Ananias, I've got a job for you." And it's the worst kind of job that Ananias could possibly imagine. He asks Ananias to go to the man who wanted him dead and to go and help him. Now, can you imagine being in that situation? If somebody hated you so much that they would drag you off to prison, beat you up, not care about you one bit, so long as you were in prison, they were happy. And you have to go and help that person. Now, you'd be a little bit cautious, And Ananias was more than just cautious. He said, Lord, I've heard everything that this man has done, and he wants me dead, and I don't want to go near him. And then God says something quite incredible, something that shows us that God's ways are not our ways. God doesn't save the people that we would expect him to save. He doesn't look for the nice people that Ananias had in mind. No, he says, I have chosen this man, Saul, this man who is breathing out murderous threats against my church, the one who's been persecuting me. I've chosen him, the one who had been trying to tear down my church, and I've chosen him to use him to build up my church. I'm going to turn him right round. So go to him, lay your hands on him, and give him back his sight. And Ananias, he relents. He's finally convinced. And so he goes to where Saul is. And here we see at the end of this story of Saul, in this episode, that the direction of his life is changed, because Ananias comes in to where Saul is. And he lays his hands on him. Not like this, as you might expect. But he lays his hands on him in a loving, gentle way. And he calls him brother. What a massive transformation. These two people who would have been at each other's throats, Saul would have happily killed Ananias or seen others kill him. And Ananias can come in and call him brother. That's not natural. That isn't from Ananias' own ability that comes. That is given to him by God, that he can say this of Saul, because Saul has been transformed by meeting the risen Jesus. That's what did it for him. Meeting the risen Jesus transformed Saul. And Saul now becomes this builder of the church instead of this destroyer of the church. And he becomes part of a new family. And he gets a new identity. And we see then these scales, this kind of flaky skin or something, falls away from his eyes, and he can see again. And he can see the world in a way that he never could before. He can see who Jesus is, and he can see who he is, and he can see what and who the church is and who it belongs to. We see then Saul's direction at the end in verse 18. He started off heading to Damascus to destroy, and then he's knocked to the ground and he goes down, but Jesus lifts him up. And then here at the end we see he rose and he went and he was baptized. Just like we saw earlier on with Claire going down into this water. This baptism of Saul's was a marker of something that had happened, an absolutely radical transformation in his life. He hated Jesus, and now his life depended on Jesus, and he loved him. He'd been transformed. This is an incredible story of salvation. And sometimes Christians, when they stand up and they want to give their testimony, tell about what Jesus has done for them, sometimes we're guilty of thinking, well, I wish I had a story like Saul's. I wish I had something that was just as remarkable as that. And the truth is you do. If you are a Christian, whether the external circumstances of your life are as dramatic as Saul's or not, the internal reality of what happens to anyone who becomes a Christian is just as drastic, just as amazing, because all of us, without exception, begin as enemies of God. We all, whether we even realize it or not, are opposed to God. And sometimes that means being a militant atheist, but often that means being a law-abiding churchgoer and relying on our own goodness and our own strength to be right with God, to be approved of by God. We're all in opposition to God, and we all need to be stopped in our tracks and to be brought low, just the way that Saul was here. He was met with a vision of the risen Christ, and his mind and his heart were radically changed. And that is what happens to everyone who becomes a Christian. We see who Jesus is in a new way. and he transforms us from the inside out. And he gives us a new direction. He gives us a new mission even, similar to the way Saul was given this new mission, from church destroyer to church builder. And everybody who is a Christian is part of this mission of church building. We all have a part to play in it. And like Saul, we're all given this new identity, so that it's as if Christ comes and lays his hands on us and says, brother, sister. This is an incredible story that all of us who are Christians can recount, and we can own this as our own. But if this all sounds just very distant, if this is not your experience, if you do not yet know Jesus, if you haven't thought about who he is, let me urge you to think about who Jesus is. What does he mean to you? Because getting Jesus wrong was disastrous for Saul. If he had continued, it would have been utter ruin. But getting Jesus right transformed his life entirely. And all of us who are Christians can say the same thing.